In 2007, the Howard government introduced the Northern Territory Intervention in an attempt to address accusations of child abuse in Indigenous communities. After over a decade, it is apparent that these measures have failed to improve conditions and in many cases have only made the problem worse. The intervention was first prompted by the Little Children Are Sacred report commissioned by the Northern Territory government to investigate claims of sexual abuse against children within Aboriginal communities. The report concluded that neglect of children had reached crisis levels and prompted the government of the day to declare a national emergency. Within 2 months, the Northern Territory National Emergency Response was drafted and proposed to the parliamentary floor. The legislation included compulsory leasing of Aboriginal land to the Australian government, prohibitions on alcohol and pornography in Aboriginal communities, and a welfare quarantine, which substantially increased the obligations for welfare recipients. It simultaneously introduced a $647 million housing program and replaced the Community Development Employment Project with the Work for the Dole and other job packages in an attempt to improve unemployment rates in these communities. Although the opposition party at the time highlighted that the legislation required further amendments to ensure the protection of Aboriginal land rights and a compliance with the Racial Discrimination Act, it received almost unanimous support from both major parties and was adopted as legislation on the 17th of August 2007. After the legislation was passed, both the Australian Greens and Democrats emphasised the failure of the government to consult with Indigenous communities about the proposed measures, highlighting that this consultation was the first recommendation of the initial report. Throughout the country, reactions from Indigenous leaders were mixed. At the time that the intervention was implemented, some Indigenous leaders did voice their support for the scheme. Rather than explicitly endorsing the method of implementation, these statements of support were based on the severity of the issues present within Aboriginal communities and the urgent need for action. Referencing the Little Children Are Sacred report, Aboriginal Australian and former National President of the Australian Labor Party, Warren Mundine, asked, "What is detrimental about the protecting of children, the protecting of women against sexual assault and physical assault?" In 2012, Marcia Langton, Chair of Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne, spoke to Fairfax Media's The Zone and expressed her support for both the original intervention and its successor, the Stronger Futures program. She stated that while she was alarmed as anyone about the racial discrimination inherent in the original act, the rest of it was fine, because it was about dealing with the problems of disadvantage. Langton highlighted that it was a failure on behalf of the Aboriginal agencies and the Northern Territory government to deliver services to the communities that prompted the Commonwealth to rescind their authority and their control. Professor Langton believes that in regards to community consultation, more women and female leaders should be given a say, highlighting that these women in fact welcomed the regulations and restrictions that the intervention imposed.
At the same time, in the communities where there is strong female leadership, you'll find Aboriginal women speaking up, saying, "We agree with having police in our communities. The police came with the intervention. We agree with having more controls on alcohol, and we are glad that they are here. And we want measures that will force people to send their children to school." So there was a very strong female leadership saying that.
Alongside Professor Langton, Bess Price is another Indigenous leader who controversially believes the intervention has improved the conditions in rural communities.
To my understanding, it has had an impact on the grog, the alcohol, and it's made life a bit better for the children.
By the way of contrast, many vocal and political figures strongly opposed the intervention. Writers of the Little Children Are Sacred report were appalled that the government had used their work to justify the intervention. They claimed that not a single action corresponds with a single recommendation, and that there is no relationship between this emergency protection and what's in our report. Prominent voices within the Aboriginal community, including Pat Turner and Muriel Bamblett, shared similar sentences regarding the program. They claim that underneath the political spin, this legislation does nothing for children, nothing for Indigenous disadvantage, and nothing to actually stop child abuse. Turner accused the government of using child sexual abuse as a Trojan horse and implementing the program as a means to once again take control of their land. Harry Nelson, a traditional owner of the Yuendumu, was among the leaders who went to Canberra in the hope of stopping the legislation from being passed. He saw the intervention as a step backwards for Aboriginal rights and acknowledgement, stating, "After all these years of fighting for our land and our freedom, this is where we end up." Many Indigenous Australians saw it as an attack on culture, whereby the government was once again trying to control the way that they lived their life.
At the moment, we are being hassled by the government, the Faxia mob, or the government, and the whole of for us to sign a 40-year lease. Sign a 40-year lease for our land. They've been attempting to do that for about, since their intervention was introduced. We said, no, we will never sign any leases, we will never give up our land.
Following the implementation of the program, it was clear that the underlying approach was vastly inadequate. The lack of consultation with Indigenous leaders was being exposed and was deemed to be a complete abuse of parliamentary system. According to the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, Mick Gooder, Australia will eventually learn from the intervention that a top-down imposition of measures will never be sustainable. He continued to suggest that working in collaboration with the Aboriginal communities will be much more effective in the long term. It is apparent that the impact of the Northern Territory intervention on Aboriginal land and their communities has been devastating. In the years after the initial report, Aboriginal leaders, academics, politicians, reporters, and many others have identified the enormous failures of the legislation and its ongoing facilitation. Ultimately, any positive ramifications of the intervention have been few and far between. A decade later, the statistics paint a stark picture. In 2017, the SBS reported that Aboriginal communities have seen an increase in the rate of youth suicide and self-harm, unemployment and incarceration, alongside no improvement in school attendance, rates of domestic violence and overcrowding homes. Despite rebranding the legislation as the Stronger Futures campaign and reintroducing the Racial Discrimination Act into the bill, little significant or positive changes have been made.